The room went quiet the second she stood up. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your chest, the kind that makes people stop breathing without realizing it. Her chair slid back slowly, deliberately, like it was part of a performance everyone had rehearsed but never spoken out loud. Sleeveless dark blue dress, sharp lines, clean edges, confidence stitched into every seam. Her heels clicked once against the marble floor, a sound too loud for such a big room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power followed her like a scent people recognized but never questioned. Every person in that boardroom knew what was coming. They felt it before she spoke. The tension had been building all morning, sitting in the corners of the glass walls, hovering above the long table polished to a mirror shine. Laptops were open, but no one typed. Coffee cups were full, but no one drank. Eyes moved anywhere except where they were supposed to. The air felt heavier than it should have, like something was about to fall and nobody wanted to be the one standing under it. At the far end of the table sat him, the black employee, the only one not dressed in gray or navy or ego. His suit was simple, clean, well-worn but pressed. His back was straight, not stiff, just steady. His hands were folded neatly in front of him, fingers relaxed, like he was holding onto patience instead of paper. His face gave nothing away. Calm eyes, alert eyes, the kind of eyes that had learned long ago to watch everything without reacting to anything. He hadn't been told why he was there. No email, no phone call, no hint, just a calendar invite marked urgent, dropped into his schedule like a command. He'd shown up early, like always, took the same seat he always took, waited. He'd learned that waiting was safer than asking. She looked straight at him now. Not with anger, not with curiosity, with finality, like a door already closed. "I don't think you fit the future of this company," she said. Her voice was even, flat, professional, no sharp edges, and somehow that made it worse. The pause that followed stretched longer than it needed to, long enough for the words to sink in, long enough for everyone in the room to feel them land heavy in public, long enough for the silence to start hurting. No one moved. No one spoke. Executives stared at their notes like the answers were hidden between lines they'd read 100 times. Assistants focused on tablets that suddenly became very interesting. A man near the window adjusted his tie twice, then stopped when he realized he was shaking. Nobody met his eyes. Nobody met hers either. This was not their moment. This was not their risk. She continued like she was reading from a list she'd memorized, each reason delivered cleanly, carefully, like bullets fired with perfect aim. Not aggressive enough, not executive material, not the image we're building. Each phrase landed with a dull thud, stacking one on top of the other. There was no room for defense, no space to explain. This wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict. He felt the heat rise slowly up his neck. Not rage, not yet. Something older, something familiar. The heat of being seen and unseen at the same time, of being judged for what you were before anyone asked what you'd done. His jaw tightened just a little, then relaxed. He forced his shoulders to stay loose. He'd learned that tension could be mistaken for guilt. Memories pressed in without asking. Late nights when the building was quiet and his light was the only one still on. Projects rescued at the last minute. Problems solved quietly so nobody would panic. Ideas offered in meetings that floated around the room until someone else repeated them louder and got the nods. He remembered smiling through it, letting it go, telling himself it was fine, because dignity was survival, because reacting had a cost he couldn't afford. She slid a folder across the table toward him. It stopped just short of his hands. White, thick, official. "Sign," she said. "HR is waiting." The words were simple, almost kind, like she was doing him a favor by making it quick. The silence that followed was louder than shouting. It filled the room, pressed against the glass walls, wrapped itself around every person sitting there. Even the building seemed to listen. The city outside continued moving, unaware that something was breaking quietly several floors above it. He picked up the pen. The weight of it surprised him. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than ink. His fingers closed around it, slow and deliberate. He opened the folder. The pages were already marked, tabs in the right places, a space waiting for his name. This was the moment everyone expected, the part of the story they'd already written in their heads. He would sign, he would stand, he would leave with his head high, because that's what men like him were supposed to do when the room decided they were done. Quiet exit, clean ending. His pen hovered above the paper. Time stretched again, long enough for a bead of sweat to form at his temple, long enough for someone at the table to exhale without realizing they'd been holding their breath, long enough for her to lean back slightly in her chair, arms folding, confident that control was still exactly where she'd left it. That's when he looked up. He didn't rush it, didn't snap his head up in defiance, just lifted his eyes and met hers, steady, calm, unflinching, no anger there, no fear either, just presence. Something shifted in that moment. It was small, almost invisible, but it moved through the room like a change in pressure before a storm. She felt it too, though she couldn't name it. Her posture stiffened just a fraction. Her smile, the one she wore when she was certain, didn't come. He didn't speak yet. He let the silence do its work. Let it stretch. Let it sit between them like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. In that stillness, he thought about everything he'd carried to get to this seat. The weight of expectations that never applied to anyone else. The constant measuring, the unspoken rules. He thought about how many times he'd swallowed words because saying them would cost him more than silence ever did. He thought about his father's voice, low and steady, telling him that dignity wasn't about winning. It was about knowing who you were even when the room told you otherwise. Around the table, eyes flicked back and forth now. Something was happening. They could feel it. The script was slipping. This pause was too long. This wasn't how it usually went. She cleared her throat just once. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Her tone was still smooth, still controlled, but the confidence underneath it wavered, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. He closed the folder gently, didn't slam it, didn't push it away, just closed it, like you close a book when you're not done reading. He placed the pen down beside it. The sound echoed louder than it should have. For the first time since the meeting began, the power in the room didn't sit entirely with her. It hovered, uncertain, waiting. She straightened in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, in calculation. She had built her career on reading rooms, on sensing weakness, on knowing when to press and when to pause. But this was unfamiliar, this calm, this refusal without words. He hadn't said a thing, and yet the room felt different now, charged, like everyone was standing on the edge of something they couldn't see yet. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the man she was trying to dismiss wasn't just another name on a list. He wasn't just a quiet worker who stayed in his lane. He wasn't just someone who fit the narrative she'd already decided on. He carried knowledge. Not gossip, not rumors, facts, systems. Decisions made in quiet rooms that never made it into meeting notes. Choices that had saved the company once, maybe twice, without ever being traced back to him. Threads that, if pulled, could unravel more than one carefully constructed story. He hadn't planned to use them, not like this. He'd hoped it would never come to this. But humiliation has a way of waking things you've kept buried for your own peace. The room waited. Her gaze locked onto his again, this time sharper, more focused. "Well," she said. The question hung there, heavy and demanding, a command disguised as patience. He took a slow breath, felt it fill his chest, felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. This was the edge, the place where silence stopped protecting you and started costing you. And just as he opened his mouth to speak, just as the future of everyone in that room tilted forward, the tension thick enough to taste, the door at the far end of the boardroom clicked softly as someone reached for the handle, unaware they were about to walk into a moment that would change everything. The days leading up to that meeting were not random. They never were. Power does not move by accident. It studies first, it watches, it waits. And she had been watching him for a long time, from behind glass walls and quiet smiles, from the head of the table where decisions felt lighter because they never landed on her shoulders the same way. She noticed how the room leaned forward when he spoke, even if they pretended not to. She noticed how conversations found clarity after his calm sentences cut through the noise. She noticed how problems that had stalled for weeks somehow resolved themselves after he quietly stepped in. And she noticed something else too, how his name never followed the success, how the credit drifted away from him like smoke, settling instead on people who spoke louder, smiled wider, looked more like what power expected to see. She called that leadership. From where she sat, leadership meant letting others carry the load while you carried the spotlight. It meant choosing faces, not facts, voices, not value. She had learned early that perception paid better than truth, and perception had a look a sound, a posture, things he did not perform. He called it survival. He didn't have the luxury of confusing the two. Survival meant understanding when to speak and when silence would keep food on the table. It meant reading rooms the way some people read contracts. It meant knowing that being right was never enough if the wrong person said it. He had learned to soften his tone, to slow his pace, to keep his hands visible, his words careful. He had learned that calm made others comfortable, even if it cost him something every time. In private conversations, she questioned his fit, not his work. Never that. That would require evidence. She questioned his presence, his energy, his calmness. He doesn't command the room, she said once, leaning back in her chair, fingers laced like the verdict was already decided. He doesn't look like authority. The words landed in a quiet office filled with nods. No one pushed back. No one asked what authority was supposed to look like, or who decided. Power rarely gets questioned when it's confident and pretty, especially when it signs checks. Those conversations stayed private. That's how these things worked. Doubt never announced itself out loud until it was time to act on it. By then, the narrative was already agreed upon. He would feel it in small ways first. Meetings he used to be invited to where his name suddenly disappeared from the list. Decisions made without his input that leaned heavily on systems he built. Praise given vaguely, never directly. He noticed. Of course he did. But noticing and challenging were two different risks. He tried once, just once, carefully, politely. In an email he read 3 times before sending, he outlined concerns about a major product rollout, the kind that could cost millions if it failed. He attached data, charts, clear projections, no accusations, no emotion, just facts laid out like an offering. He chose his words the way a man chooses steps across thin ice. She never replied. Days passed, then weeks. The project moved forward anyway. The unease stayed with him, a tight feeling in his chest that never quite went away. He attended the meetings, listened, watched. And then, one afternoon, the same concerns resurfaced, spoken by another executive, louder, more confident, less careful. The room leaned in. She smiled, praised the insight, approved changes on the spot, called it sharp thinking, strategic leadership. His name was never mentioned. Not once. He sat there, hands folded, face still. He had learned that reactions could be misread. Anger made you a problem. Hurt made you weak. Silence, at least, kept you employed. So he nodded along like everyone else. He wrote notes he didn't need. He swallowed the familiar ache and told himself it was fine. He told himself this was how it worked. Speak softly. Work twice as hard. Don't react. Don't give them a reason. But injustice has a way of stacking up. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in pieces. Small cuts you barely feel at first. A comment here, an email ignored there, a promotion delayed, a compliment redirected. You tell yourself you're imagining it. You tell yourself to be grateful. You tell yourself not to make it about race, about power, about things that make people uncomfortable. And then one day you look up and realize you've been bleeding quietly for years. The firing wasn't about performance. Everyone in that boardroom knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Sales were up. His division was steady. Clients trusted him. His name came up in feedback more than once, always attached to words like reliable, thoughtful, consistent. This wasn't about numbers. It was about optics, about control, about reminding everyone in the room who sat at the top and who could be removed without noise. As he sat there with the folder open in front of him, memories flooded in uninvited. His father's voice came first, low, firm, telling him to keep his dignity no matter what, telling him that a man's worth didn't come from titles or rooms he was allowed into, but from how he carried himself when those things were taken away. His mother's voice followed, softer but just as strong, warning him that silence was expensive, that it could protect you, but it could also cost you pieces of yourself if you weren't careful. She had always said there would come a time when he'd have to choose which price he was willing to pay. He felt that choice sitting heavy on his chest now. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching him like a problem she expected to resolve itself. You have until the end of the day, she said. Calm. Controlled. Like she was offering him mercy, like the power in the room was still exactly where she wanted it. The words echoed. Until the end of the day. As if dignity had an expiration time. As if respect could be scheduled between meetings. Around them the room stayed quiet. Too quiet. People avoided his eyes. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Fear of being next. Fear of being seen choosing a side. Fear of breaking the invisible rules that kept them safe. He understood that fear. He lived with it every day. But understanding it didn't make it hurt less. He looked down at the papers again. His name printed neatly at the top. Lines waiting to be filled. A future already written without his consent. He thought about signing. About standing up. About walking out with his head high and his heart heavy. He thought about his family, about bills, about how quickly respect could vanish once a paycheck stopped coming. He thought about how easy it would be to let this be the end of the story. But pressure does something to people. It squeezes away the extras, strips things down to what's real. And under pressure, truth doesn't break. It surfaces. He felt it rising now. Not anger, not revenge. Something steadier, something rooted. A clarity that came from being pushed too far without ever being asked to move. He realized that the calm she criticized, the quiet she mistook for weakness, had been building something inside him all along. A patience sharpened by years of watching, listening, learning where the real power lines ran beneath the polished floors and glass walls. She had watched him too. But she had only seen what fit her story. She hadn't seen the late nights when he stayed behind not to impress anyone but because he understood systems better when they were quiet. She hadn't seen the decisions made in empty rooms, the fixes applied before problems became public. She hadn't seen how many fires never started because he noticed the smoke early. And now, with the weight of the moment pressing down on him, all of that knowledge sat just beneath the surface. Waiting, the room felt different, charged, like the air before lightning. She sensed it too, even if she didn't understand it yet. Her confidence didn't waver on the outside, but something in her eyes sharpened, calculating, curious. She had expected tears, or anger, or resignation. She had not expected stillness. "End of the day," she repeated, a little firmer this time. He didn't respond. Not yet. He let the silence stretch again, let it press back, let it make space for something new. He knew that once he spoke there would be no going back. Whatever he said next would change things. Maybe not for the better, maybe not for him, but definitely for the story she thought she controlled. Around the table discomfort grew. Chairs shifted, a cough broke and then stopped. Someone glanced at the door like an escape might appear. No one spoke, no one interrupted. It was like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first. He felt the weight of every year that had led him here. Every moment he had chosen patience over protest. Every time he had been told to wait his turn in a line that never seemed to move. He realized that this wasn't just about a job. It was about being seen. About refusing to disappear quietly just to make the room more comfortable. She thought the pressure was on him. She thought the clock was ticking in her favor. What she didn't realize was that pressure had already done its work. It had peeled back the fear. It had cleared the noise. It had brought him to a place where the truth was no longer something he carried alone. He lifted his eyes again, meeting hers. The room leaned in without meaning to, and in that moment, with the end of the day hanging in the air like a threat and a promise all at once, it became clear that this story was no longer moving in a straight line. Something was about to surface, something that had been quiet for a long time, and once it did, there would be no pretending it wasn't there. He picked up the pen, and the room breathed again. It was subtle, almost invisible, but you could feel it. Shoulders dropped, jaws unclenched. Someone near the window finally took a sip of water. This was the ending they knew. The safe one. The kind where power stayed where it belonged and nothing uncomfortable followed anyone home. She noticed it too. Of course she did. A small smile touched her lips, barely there. The kind of smile that said control had returned to its proper place. The pen rested between his fingers. Solid, cool. He rolled it once, slowly, like he was feeling its weight. He looked down at the paper, eyes moving across words he already knew by heart. Termination. Effective immediately, standard language, clean, final. And then he turned the page. The sound was soft, paper against paper, but it landed like a crack through glass. A few heads lifted. Someone frowned. The rhythm of the room broke just enough for uncertainty to slip in. He cleared his throat, not because he was nervous, because silence had done its job and now it was time to speak. "I won't be signing this," he said. His voice was calm, steady, not loud, not sharp, just clear. Her smile vanished, not slowly, instantly, like it had never been there at all. "What?" she asked, blinking once like she'd misheard. "I won't be signing this," he repeated, still calm, still seated, still very much in control of his own breath. A murmur moved through the room. Not voices, energy. Chairs shifted again, but this time it wasn't relief. It was tension finding new places to sit. She leaned forward, palms pressing lightly against the table. "This isn't a discussion," she said. Her tone stayed even, but something hard crept into it. "We've already reviewed your position." "I understand," he said. Then he turned another page, careful, deliberate. "That's why I'll be invoking Clause 14b. The words hung there, unfamiliar to most ears. "The internal accountability provision," he continued, "the one tied to executive review." Confusion rippled across the table, real confusion this time, not the polite kind people used when they were pretending to listen. Brows furrowed, eyes darted toward the legal team. Someone whispered a question they didn't expect to ask today. She stiffened, her spine straightened, shoulders squared like she was putting armor back on. "That clause is obsolete," she said quickly. "Too quickly. It hasn't been used in years." He shook his head once. "Small. Certain. It isn't," he said. "And I know that because I helped write it." Silence fell again. But this silence was different. Heavier, thicker. It pressed down instead of stretching out. The kind of silence that makes people very aware of their own heartbeat. Someone at the far end of the table swallowed hard. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, in calculation. This was new ground. She had not prepared for this path. He reached into his bag and pulled out a second folder, thicker than the first. He slid it across the table, stopping it in the center, where everyone could see it. Tabs stuck out along the side, marked neatly, emails printed and highlighted, charts, timelines, audit trails laid out with quiet care. "This," he said, resting his hand on the folder, "is the work you've been celebrating for the last 18 months. She didn't reach for it. Neither did anyone else. He didn't rush. He never did. He opened the folder himself and turned it so the room could see. He explained slowly, choosing each word like it mattered. Because it did. He talked about the crisis that had nearly sunk the company before it ever made headlines. The one that happened late on a Friday when most people had already gone home. The one no one wanted to take responsibility for. He had stayed. He talked about the system he built in those quiet nights. How he mapped risks others overlooked. How he designed fail-safes no one noticed because they never failed. How he stitched together solutions from pieces people thought didn't fit. He didn't brag. He didn't dramatize. He just told the truth. The room listened. He explained how that same system had driven the growth investors loved, the efficiency, the speed, the stability that magazines praised and awards celebrated. He pointed to dates, numbers, proof, everything clean, everything traceable. Then his tone shifted, not in volume, in weight. "And here," he said, turning another page, "is the part that was never addressed." He spoke about a compliance vulnerability buried deep inside the framework, one he'd flagged early, one he'd written about in that email she never answered, one he'd brought up again, quietly, carefully, and was told not to worry about. "A risk," he said simply, "that was postponed, not resolved." Her face began to drain of color, slowly at first, like the room was getting colder and she hadn't noticed yet. He explained what would happen if that vulnerability was exposed outside the company. Investigations, regulatory scrutiny, fines that wouldn't make headlines but would hurt, resignations that would, trust shaken in places money couldn't fix. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He was factual. "I tried to warn you," he said, meeting her eyes again. "You didn't listen." The words landed without force, and somehow that made them impossible to dodge. The board shifted in their seats. Not all at once, one by one, a ripple of discomfort moving around the table. The legal team finally leaned forward, exchanging looks that said more than any whisper could. They had read these clauses. They knew what they meant. They knew what invoking them could trigger. For the first time since she'd entered the room, she wasn't the center of gravity anymore. The air no longer bent toward her. She opened her mouth, then closed it. That alone told the room everything. She had answers for situations she controlled. Not for this. He closed the folder gently and pushed it back to the center. "Clause 14b requires an internal review," he said. "Independent, documented. It pauses all termination actions involving parties connected to system-level decisions." Her jaw tightened. "You're saying this is retaliation?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm saying this is accountability. Another silence. This one stretched, heavy with meaning. People glanced at each other, at the papers, at her. The hierarchy they had walked in with felt less solid now, like something had cracked beneath the polished floor. She leaned back slowly, eyes never leaving him. "You understand what you're doing," she said. "I do," he replied. "And you understand the consequences," she added. "Yes," he said again. What he didn't say but everyone could feel was that he had understood the consequences long before today. He had lived with them quietly, carried them home, tucked them away so he could keep moving forward. This moment wasn't reckless. It was earned. The chair beside her scraped softly as someone shifted closer. A lawyer cleared his throat. "We'll need to review this," he said carefully, choosing his words like they were stepping stones across deep water. She nodded. Once, sharp. Still trying to regain footing. "Of course," she said. "We'll follow procedure." Procedure. The word tasted different now. He sat back in his chair for the first time since the meeting began, not relaxed, but settled, like someone who had finally put down a heavy bag they'd been carrying for miles. No one told him to leave. No one asked him to stay. The room existed in a strange in-between. Power no longer sat in one place. It moved, quietly, decisively. She gathered herself, smoothing the front of her dress, adjusting a cuff that didn't need adjusting, small gestures, human ones, cracks showing through the polish. "We'll adjourn," she said finally. People stood slowly, unsure of the rules now. Conversations didn't start right away. Eyes lingered, whispers waited until doors closed. He remained seated for a moment longer, letting the noise fade. He felt the weight of what he'd done settle into his chest. Not fear, not pride, a deep, steady sense of alignment, like he'd finally stood where he was always meant to stand, even if it came late. As he rose, she caught his eye one last time. There was something there now that hadn't been before. Not respect, not yet, but recognition. The understanding that the story she thought she controlled had changed chapters without asking her permission. He walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Behind him, the folder sat open on the table, pages exposed, truth laid bare. And for the first time in a long time, the silence he left behind did not belong to him. The meeting didn't end with applause. There was no dramatic speech, no victory smile, no one stood to clap. It ended the way hard truths usually do. Quiet, heavy, unfinished. HR was dismissed first, asked to step out with polite words that couldn't hide the urgency underneath. Lawyers stayed behind, their notebooks open now, pens moving faster than before. The board requested a recess, a short break at first, just enough to review documents. That break stretched. Minutes turned into an hour turned into several. The room emptied and filled again, like the building itself was breathing through a long moment of reckoning. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were postponed without explanation. People whispered in hallways, their voices low, their eyes alert. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if they didn't yet understand what it meant for them. Power, when it stumbles, makes noise even when it tries to stay silent. By the end of the week, the story inside the company had changed, not in a press release, not in a headline, but in the way people spoke to each other, in the way meetings slowed down just enough to let quieter voices finish their thoughts, in the way certain names started coming up again, attached to ideas they should have always been attached to. She wasn't fired. That much surprised some people. Others understood. Power protects itself, even when it learns a lesson. But she was humbled, publicly. The board didn't hide it. They didn't soften it. They announced a restructuring that made it clear something had gone wrong at the top. New oversight, new checks, new leadership roles designed to make sure no single voice could dismiss another so easily again. And then came the announcement that shocked everyone. Him, promoted. Not quietly, not buried in an email, announced in the same rooms where he'd once been ignored. His new role wasn't symbolic. It carried weight, authority, access, the kind that couldn't be brushed aside with comments about fit or image. People watched his reaction closely, waiting for a smile, a nod of triumph, a look that said he'd finally won. It never came. He accepted the promotion quietly, not with celebration, with clarity. He thanked the board. He acknowledged the work ahead. He didn't mention the past. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room felt it anyway. The weight of it, the cost of getting here. He returned to his desk that afternoon like he always did, sat down, opened his laptop, took a breath. The view hadn't changed. The city still stretched out beyond the windows, indifferent and vast. But something inside him had settled, not because he'd climbed higher, but because he hadn't been pushed out of the story this time. Days later, she requested a private conversation. No cameras, no assistants hovering by the door, no polished table separating them. Just two chairs in a small conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the kind of room decisions were made in when people didn't want witnesses. She arrived first, sat down, smoothed the front of her dress like she used to, out of habit. When he entered, she stood, not out of strategy, out of something closer to respect. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't tense this time. It was thoughtful, honest. "I misjudged you," she said finally. Her voice was lower than before, less certain, the sharp edge gone. "I thought power looked a certain way." He nodded once, slow. "Most people do," he said. She looked at him then, really looked, not like a problem to solve, not like a risk to manage, like a person whose weight she had underestimated. "I'm sorry," she said. No excuses, no long explanation, just the words offered plainly. "I didn't listen, and I should have." He studied her face. He could see it now, the discomfort, the humility, the understanding that had taken too long to arrive but was real all the same. "Thank you," he said. Not forgiving everything, but acknowledging the moment. Something rare happened in that small room. Power listened. Not because it was forced to, but because it had learned that refusing to listen carried consequences it couldn't afford again. The changes that followed didn't come overnight. They never do. But they came. Policies shifted, not just rewritten but rethought. Review processes slowed down, became more deliberate. Meetings were structured to make space, not just for the loudest voices, but for the ones that carried substance. People who had learned to stay quiet out of habit began to speak again, testing the air, surprised to find it safer than before. The company didn't just survive the reckoning. It changed. Not because it wanted good press, not because it was trendy, but because it was necessary. He noticed it in small moments. A junior analyst thanked for catching a mistake early, a suggestion credited properly, a pause in a meeting that felt intentional, like someone was waiting to hear more instead of rushing ahead. These were not grand gestures. They were signs, proof that the culture was bending, even if it wasn't fully healed. He carried himself the same way he always had, calm, steady. But now, when he spoke, people listened without needing to be reminded, not because of his title, but because of the story that had followed him into the room. She carried herself differently too, less certain in the old way, more careful. She asked questions she never would have asked before. She listened longer, and when she spoke, she weighed her words, aware now of how heavy they could be. The lesson didn't stay inside those walls. It traveled, in conversations people had at home, talking about work in ways they hadn't before. In young employees watching closely, learning what dignity looked like when tested. In leaders realizing that authority without humility was a fragile thing, easily cracked. And if you listened closely, beneath all the changes and titles and meetings there was a simpler truth beating steadily. True power doesn't humiliate. True leadership doesn't silence. And dignity, when carried patiently, eventually outweighs even the sharpest authority. Because the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the loudest truth. And when that truth finally speaks, it doesn't need to shout.